Я сейчас предоставлю слово Джулии Карбоне, которая расскажет, собственно говоря, чем еще с точки зрения международных экспертов отличаются сами по себе корпоративные программы по сохранению биоразнообразия от благотворительности. То есть в чем отличие рутинной каждодневной деятельности от разовых вложений и спонсорства. Julia, I'm very glad to see you once more on our conference. At the same time, inviting you to presentation. Oh, really? It's a surprise. Thank you.
I'm still going to speak in English, so I don't know if it's better if everybody otherwise, or we have a new set of translators. So, Svetlana invited me to make a very quick presentation, more theoretical, and that's why I'll be trying to be fast, because I see there are a lot of interesting examples, and I do not want to take away time from the interesting examples, such as the one Natalia just presented and the one before, and many after. To present a little bit more in theory the difference between what is corporate action and what is philanthropy. So there are a number of, I'll dive right into a famous image that maybe many of you have seen before to highlight the difference between how a company can walk the journey in addressing their impacts at the company level, and where philanthropy lies in this. So the message is that philanthropic action has been very important in terms of also conservation in the past, and it is still very important. But what is critical is to differentiate what is the company responsibility in addressing their impacts, and where philanthropic action lies in this journey. So to the left, you have the whole sequence of how the different measures that a company can adopt to address their impacts, how we call them in different ways depending on the amount of impacts they remove. So first, you have avoidance action. So all the activities that a company can adopt to make sure that impacts actually are avoided. And for example, the most effective one probably is site selection. So changing site is probably the best way to avoid impact. So Natalia, for example, explained how they changed site, how they rerouted the pipeline. That is avoidance by site selection design. Is a combination of the two, but it's actually site selection. You went in a different place and then you redesign also your pipelines. And scheduling is also a very important one. For example, seismic survey, scheduling in seasons when wells are not there yet, it's avoidance of impact. Then you have the second tier, still is about anticipation of impacts, and it's about minimizing. So here we are talking about the green actions that actually still they're gonna have a bit of impact, but mostly will try to minimize these. So for example, reducing the sound of seismic survey is impact minimization. You're still gonna have an impact, but you're trying to limit this one. Then you have a whole set of other activities which we call in this remediated. So they remediate an impact that has occurred, but it's still part of the company responsibility in relation to their impact. So you're talking about restoration, and here we are looking at reestablishing habitats, biodiversity values, ecosystem services, and these are activities within the site of the impact. So it's easier to think about terrestrial. So if, for example, you have used an area for construction in mining, for example, is very common. After you finish mining, you actually restore as much as possible the area that you have mined. That action is the restoration step on the mitigation hierarchy. Then you have projects outside the area of your influence, outside, beyond where you have had your impact, and these are the offsets. These are, however, are, in order to qualify as offset, you have to be able to quantify them. Quantify their benefits compared to the residual impact you had on biodiversity. So here you see the gray area is all what we call residual impact on the biodiversity value that is our reference. So for example, we are talking about Western grey whale, which is the reason why we were here. We are trying to quantify what is the residual impact on the Western grey whale, and therefore how can you go beyond the actions you have already taken to avoid, minimize, and restore to go out and offset. For example, all right, we try another to restore your impacts. So this is the mitigation hierarchy. And then you have, however, what we call additional conservation actions, which are actions that what is also known as philanthropic actions, conservation projects that are not, you cannot quantify, and it's difficult to link to your impacts, but they're still valuable. And we have so many interesting and valuable activities that have been done in the past by companies, not only on conservation, of course, there are a lot of social projects, and these are absolutely critical. But what is very important, however, is to differentiate where they stand in this hierarchy. So there are a whole set of activities that are absolutely a must in terms of addressing the impact of a company, and other activities that are in addition. That's why we call them additional conservation action. So the two are complementary, but in the way, let's say, IUCN recommendation resolutions issued by members, the primary responsibility of business is to address their impacts. And that comes first. And then afterwards, the conservation actions are absolutely a benefit for biodiversity, but we don't see the option of having philanthropy before actually having the company addressing its own impacts. Just as an example, IUCN has very strict guidelines in terms of how we engage with business. And when we talk with business of what we call high risk, we don't engage for philanthropic contributions unless we have a programmatic engagement to address their impact first. So that comes first, and then comes the philanthropy. So just as, for example, an example on protected areas. We have been talking earlier about protected areas, the value that business can bring to protected areas. This is an example of an IUCN recommendations that was just issued in 2016 to the most recent Conservation Congress. And here is actually calling businesses to avoid impacts in protected areas. And that's the best way actually a business can contribute to conservation of protected areas, avoiding destroying the biodiversity values. This is telling stories. It's not about putting more money in a protected areas, but it's about avoidance of actually having activities that would deteriorate the biodiversity value. And last but not least, however, there are a lot of opportunities, and there is also a positive side of business engagement in conservation. And as I said, philanthropic activities, but not only, because there are a lot of opportunities in creating biodiversity businesses, where there is businesses that can create a direct stream of revenues to protected areas. Again? Okay. I feel like. All right. Then you get to vote which one was the best system. Entry fees, license fees, users fees, offsets, but also what they call payment for ecosystem programs. There are a lot of interesting tools that you can have for certain type of business operations. So not all sectors can create biodiversity businesses, but as IUCN we have worked, for example, a lot on tourism to become like an agent for contributing to conservation, but not necessarily through philanthropy, but by the very by creating business ventures that actually directly contribute to conservation. Alternative livelihood opportunities, very well, often the pressure on protected areas, for example, comes from unsustainable livelihoods, and creating businesses that take away the pressure is also a very effective way to conserve, and not necessarily bringing money through philanthropy, but actually creating a an incentive to protect directly the conservation. We have been a lot of examples again through, for example, ecotourism, by giving a tourism values, for example, to the visit, for example, to areas where you have turtle nesting, and so the community, instead of taking the eggs away or killing and consuming the turtles, they see that actually alive they are much more valuable to them than dead. So that's a little bit the rationale. It's always trying to figure out what is the value to people and how you can integrate it into a business. So that was a little bit, hopefully short enough, just to give you back the overview. Additional conservation action, very important, but first and foremost, the mitigation hierarchy, as Natalia was presenting, and I'm really looking forward to all the presentation afterwards, because I'm sure they're going to give us a lot of interesting examples on how to put this in practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. К сожалению, да, как видите, у нас количество технических средств поддержки постоянно в каком-то движении. И тоже живой процесс, это, наверное, хорошо. Спасибо, Джулия еще раз нам напомнила о необходимости внедрения меры иерархии с точки зрения внедрения своих корпоративных программ и что отличает сами по себе программы от филантропической деятельности. А теперь давайте уже...